What is suffering? When I ask you that question, what do you think of? Is it pain, illness, starvation, death, certain people in certain impoverished parts of the world? Maybe it's your own experience. What is suffering? But what about pain? What about illness? Are these themselves suffering? Think about the last time that you were suffering. What was it that reminds you, that makes you think of that moment? Is it the physical pain itself? Or is it the emotion? The reaction that you had to that situation that marks the suffering you experienced? Maybe it was illness, maybe it was disappointment, embarrassment, any experience where you suffered. Why did you experience that emotion? Was it because you were in pain? Or was it something a bit deeper? So when I stubbed my toe against this concrete brick, did I suffer? In this case, no. I experienced pain and it bloody hurts, but it was not suffering. Instead, if you accidentally knock your elbow against the wall or you stub your toe, you may feel a momentary pang of suffering. But that suffering is not because of the pain or because of even the emotion of anger. It's because it fundamentally undermines an assumption about you. Because when we stub our toe, the real reason why we suffer, at least in that small moment, an example, is because we realize that by stubbing our toe, it undermines an aspect of our control. It undermines a part of us that says, you're not stupid enough to stub your toe. You're in good enough control of your body to not make that mistake. We're getting closer to what suffering is, but we're still not there yet. Because when we suffer in a situation, it's because we've fundamentally shaken our assumption of what our relationship to the world is. Whenever we have sudden death or illness or anything unexpected that makes us suffer, we're suffering because our sense of control has been undermined. That's what leads to the emotions of anger, of tears, of sadness, of suffering. It's because we believe we've got a vision of control, an identity of ourselves, of how we can govern our own lives and our own existence. And when something that comes out of the blue, it doesn't fit with that picture because it's unexpected. That's why we suffer. Think about the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression. That is when we suffer. When finally one accepts the 5th stage, there is suffering no longer. What are we accepting? We normally would think you're accepting the situation. But at the core, what we're accepting is that the world has the ultimate control. That we don't have the power to change our own condition. But this is not how all of us respond to suffering. You may accept, but that acceptance leads to hope. It leads to goals and action. Someone fighting cancer who does not accept the condition that they're in. It seems like if suffering reminds us of our powerlessness, we have 2 ways to deal with it. We can accept, or we can take action. We can empower ourselves to overcome the condition that the world has imposed upon us. It seems immensely powering. It seems like an immense glimmer of hope. But is that the true way for us to overcome suffering? Because notice that even though we can seemingly momentarily overcome suffering by setting actions, by resolving to improve our conditions and our state, we're only playing into the trap which suffering sets for us, which is that we still believe in this tug of war that says that we can win against the environment and the world that's imposed upon us. And ultimately, when we fail again, we suffer. We haven't dealt with suffering. So how do we actually deal with suffering? Well, have a think about the last time you did some exercise, or you just played a game. You went out for a run, a workout, just took your mind off the matter at hand. Maybe you come back afterwards and think about it, but in that moment, as you're doing something else, you realize you're not suffering, at least not consciously in that moment. It's because in that moment, we're not thinking, we're not trying to control our state. Instead, it just goes by us. And we recognize that to be the world simply coming by and us not struggling against it. And so the true, lasting, and sustainable way for us to deal with suffering is not to try to take back control, but to remind ourselves that we don't have control and that it's okay for the world to impose what it does upon us. That we should be letting things come and simply accepting them for what they are. You know, you might push back. What are you saying? We should just let people suffer? We should just suffer ourselves? We should just let hardship, poverty, famine, disease right through the world? No, absolutely not. Our individual approach to suffering, the thing of suffering, does not mean that we need to accept our condition. Of course, we need to deal with the major issues that we're facing. Of course, pain is a bad state to be in. But ultimately, dealing with the issue is different to the psychological experience of suffering. And we can detach the two. And when we can approach suffering with this renewed perspective, we're able to solve the problem more effectively. We're able to actually empower ourselves by paradoxically realizing we don't have the power. Because when we live in this world, we actually live in a torture chamber. A torture chamber because we get imposed the experiences upon us that we cannot actually control. People do things, the world does things that we have no power over. And the hardest thing to realize about the torture chamber of our life is that our torturers, for those of us who are lucky, aren't reminded that we're in the torture chamber. That when we live in this world, things simply happen and they feel awesome most of the time. But then when that torture comes, when the torturer imposes their will, we're suddenly zapped. And it's in that moment, And we can either realize we live in a torture chamber, a chamber where we can't control what happens to us, or we can struggle and we can say, what is going on? Why don't I have control over this? That is our decision, to suffer or not to suffer in this torture chamber. Have a great day. And have a good life. All the best. Catch you.